We've talked thus far about how many features of the human mind make religious thinking recurrent through human societies. But of course, not everybody considers themselves religious. Who are the non-religious? And given our shared mental architecture, how did they get that way? We end this module by talking about two such groups, those who plainly call themselves atheists, and those who refer to themselves by the more nebulous term, spiritual but not religious. Both these groups are growing in number, especially among my generation of millennials. Why is that happening? Well, I asked Dr. Ayanna Willard, a research psychologist and fellow millennial, at a conference in Vancouver. So we're here with Dr. Ayanna Willard, and we're here in one of the wealthier areas of Vancouver, where religion seems to have really faded from focus. It's faded from importance, and fewer people identify as being religious. This is a pattern that we see in a lot of parts over the world. Why do we see that exodus from organized religion?
So, there's lots of different reasons why this happens. One of them is just a sense of safety and security that living in an environment like this gives you. So a lot of the roles that religion as an institution played in the past, making people feel more secure in their environment, providing things like healthcare, different sorts of resources for childcare. And when you live in a wealthy place like this, especially here in Canada where we have all sorts of social services that support people, those needs that religion as an institution fulfilled in the past are sort of disappearing. But I think it's worth specifying that it's the institutional role of religion that's disappearing, not necessarily the belief systems themselves. In a place like Vancouver, people may be leaving religion, they may no longer be identifying as something like a Christian, but there's a huge community of spiritual but not religious people here. So people are very much into meditation and yoga and various other alternative belief systems. It's not that belief itself is disappearing, it's not that people are becoming purely atheistic non-believers, it's that they're leaving that institution. So there's something about these belief systems that people still find intuitive or appealing.
Well, that's interesting. So of that group that's left religion, some of them become this category of spiritual not religious who maintain those supernatural beliefs, and others seem to abandon both the organized religion as well as the supernatural beliefs. What makes those two groups differ?
So there is a lot of individual differences in how much we use theory of mind or the ability to think about other people's minds. And this goes all the way from like autism spectrum disorder right up to people who are overly mentalizing the world. And this tendency to use mental state reasoning to explain things differs across populations. And you see this difference between men and women. Women are much better at theory of mind reasoning, are much better at reasoning about other people's minds than men, and they tend to do it more often.
And they tend to be more religious.
They tend to be more religious. But you also see this coming out in other things like analytical thinking. So the tendency to carefully reason about the world versus thinking about the world in terms of basic intuitions. Those differences also kind of lead to this split. So people who tend to think more carefully about the world or reason in a sort of slow manner versus using quick heuristic intuitions also tend to be less religious.
This religious difference between intuitive and analytical thinking has been demonstrated in some very interesting ways. Now, there have been a number of terms that roughly map onto the same sort of division in thinking. There's System 1 and System 2 thinking, thinking fast and slow, the hot and cold system, Kirk and Spock. Intuitive thinking is a quick automatic form of thinking based on rules of thumb. Analytical thinking is a more logical, reflective form of thinking based on conscious reasoning processes. Now, everyone uses both forms of thinking, and there are certainly situations when either one is better than the other. But people differ in the relative degree to which they rely on the two forms of thinking. One of the ways that researchers measure these differences is through what's called the cognitive reflection task, which is simply just a set of quiz questions, each of which has a right answer, and attempting an intuitive but wrong answer. The most famous of these goes as follows. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, the rapid intuitive answer that probably first popped into your head was 10 cents. But then your System 2, your slow, cold, Spockish system kicks in and thinks, well, Sharif just told me that the intuitive answer was going to be wrong, so I should resist that answer and do some careful calculations. And then you realize that it has to be 5 cents for the ball and $1.05 for the bat. People's performance on this set of cognitive reflection task questions ends up being the measure of their analytical versus intuitive thinking style. In 2011, no fewer than 3 different research groups were testing this connection between religiosity and cognitive thinking style. All 3 groups found consistent results, that the poorer you did on the cognitive reflection task, the more likely you were to believe in God. Here's one of those papers. So you can see from this chart that of the 3 questions that made up the cognitive reflection task, the number of questions that a participant answered in the intuitive style was directly related to their likelihood of saying that they had an experience that convinced them that God exists. Of those who answered all the questions analytically, 39% said they had such an experience. But of those who answered all the questions intuitively, 59% said they had such an experience. And this relationship, though small, still holds when you statistically control for level of education, IQ, income, gender, political orientation, and a host of other variables. Which is to say that if you take 2 people who are identical on all those measures, same IQ, same level of education, etc., just one is more intuitive in their thinking style than the other, you can predict that the intuitive thinker is going to be more religious than the analytical thinker. But there's more. There's actually been quite a bit of experimental work, including work by researcher Will Gervais, that seeks to disentangle the causal relationship between religiosity and thinking style. Using several different methods, these groups of researchers set up experiments where one group is kept in a control condition and another group is induced to think in analytical ways. In one study, they had people think back to a time when they successfully used either an intuitive thinking style or an analytical thinking style. In another study, they subtly and implicitly primed people with words that related to the idea of analytical thinking. In a third study, they encouraged people to think more effortfully by presenting them with text that was in a hard-to-read font, a process that's called disfluency. And in my favorite of these studies, they had one group spend time looking at the statue of the thinker, and the other group look at the statue of the discobulus. And in all of these studies, those participants who had their analytical thinking style ramped up reported lower belief in God. That is, thinking analytically actually reduced religious belief. Now, some of you may have heard about something called the Flynn effect, the finding that over the 20th century, IQ scores kept going up by about 3 points a decade. Now, one of the proposed explanations for the Flynn effect is that we've shifted to a more analytical thinking style. If that's true, then this connection between analytical thinking and decreased religious belief could explain why we've seen the belief in God decline over the past several decades, a decline that we'll talk more about in the last module of the course. But for now, let's go back to talking to Dr. Willard about how not all those who left behind religion have left behind belief.
You see this in the Czech Republic, that despite people leaving religion, there's still a high number of supernatural beliefs. So about 40% of the sample we took, which was 1,000 people in a representative sample, believed that there was some sort of universal force in the universe, some guiding force. They may not say there's a personal God, they may not say that God is this person in the sort of Christian sense, but they still believe in something. And you also see fairly high levels of belief in astrology, belief in ESP, all of these things. And these tend to come together as a package. People who believe in astrology tend to also believe in a lot of other related things.
So in places where organized religion really crumbles and fades away, we're still not going to see everybody gravitating towards this harshly analytical, fully naturalistic, atheistic perspective.
There's lots of places now where religious systems have disappeared, largely in Scandinavia, but there's nowhere where we see no believers. So Scandinavia is another place where you get a lot of spiritual but not religious people kind of coming out. And then you look at places like Japan, where people wouldn't say they're religious because it's just not part of their culture, but they still participate in all sorts of religious rituals. They go to Shinto shrines. They have different sort of religious practices or supernatural practices for pretty much every point in their lives.
So while there's undoubtedly a growing contingent of people who've turned their back on both the institutional and spiritual aspects of religion, there's a good chunk of people who've just adopted a more personal, free-floating form of spirituality. Now, this makes sense. There are a lot of reasons why people would become estranged from or disaffected with institutional religion. But given that we all share these naturally occurring mental features, things like intuitive dualism, or the hyperactive agency detection device, or promiscuous teleology, or a fear of death and uncertainty, there is much that will continue to draw us towards spiritual and supernatural intuitions. But whereas these naturally occurring psychological features can explain why individuals came to think in religious ways in the first place, there are a whole host of other group-level factors that unified and shaped beliefs into the social phenomena that we call organized religion. We'll talk about how and why that happened in the next module.